Well, hello, good people of the world. It's the Big Heavy, and assuming you're watching this video, you've probably had some recent bad news on the employment front, or maybe some sort of unplanned career change is imminent. And look, I'm just some random dude on the internet, but I feel for you. I've been there. Regardless of your physiology, it's a kick in the balls, it sucks, not something that you want to go through. So I'm sending positive vibrations your way. And what I've tried to put together here is kind of the 12 steps I use to get back into my groove after having gone through getting fired, or whatever the latest HR euphemism is for being shit-canned, riffed, downsized, right-sized, offshored, inshored, whatever they're calling it these days. And this video is less about like the technical aspects of finding a new job. There's a zillion videos out there about how to write a resume, how to set up your LinkedIn profile, all that jazz. I'm gonna cover more the 12 steps I use to stay in a groove, keep yourself sane, and ultimately, hopefully come out the other side of this process a better version of yourself with a new gig, feeling good about the world, and ready to tackle that new opportunity. So let's jump into those 12 steps. And the first step is have yourself a good old pity party. Now, there's 3 rules to this pity party. Number 1, don't do anything that's going to cause long-term damage to yourself, land you in jail, damage relationships, or anything like that. Number 2, don't share that pity party with your current or your recently current employer or any people that work there. And number 3, this pity party is limited to 24 hours. So if you're in like week 3 of a good old pity party, you've kind of used up your allocation and it's time to move on. If you're suspecting bad news or you just got it, do whatever you feel like you need to do to kind of wallow in your own pity. Maybe that's eating a whole pint of ice cream. Maybe that's having a few too many Manhattans. Maybe that's going and taking an angry run or swimming angry laps. Maybe it's going outside and shaking your fist at the inequities of the universe and that jerk in accounting or that jamoke in HR or the executive from your company. And if you really feel like you want to get something off your chest, don't do anything electronic, since even drafts in your corporate email are probably tracked and logged somewhere, especially if you're on the list of people that are going to be exited in the near future. But if you feel like you need to bust out your notepad, write the meanest, nastiest letter in the universe to your CEO, and then once your pity party is over, you can shred that. I'd recommend burning it, since there's something fun about fire.
Fire, 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 fire.
But do whatever you do, have all the woe is me you want, but after 24 hours, you gotta be done with that nonsense. And then it's time to get to work, which leads us to step 2. And step 2 is around reframing. If you haven't heard this term before, basically the simplified version is the old thing about a glass being half full or a glass being half empty. 2 people could look at the same glass, one sees it as half full, one sees it as half empty. And yes, getting canned is not a glass half full situation. It's more of a, hey, at least I've got a glass kind of situation. And the way I'd start to deal with that reframing is, again, bust out your notepad. You can do this exercise mentally. You can do it on a device of some sort, but take a good 20, 30 minutes, even a couple hours if you need it, and think back over the past year, 18 months or so, to all the times you said, if only I didn't have a full-time job, I would do X. And there's probably a whole bunch of X's. We've all kind of lamented, hey, if I didn't have to spend 40 hours a week working for somebody else, I would learn Spanish. I would learn how to play ragtime piano. I would, build that mobile app that I've always been dreaming of. I would start a business. All these sorts of things. And those things could be mundane. They might be just organizing your closet. They might be, wildly elaborate multi-year goals. Maybe you'd go back to school and learn how to be a professional chef or something like that. But take a few minutes to think about all those things that you would do if you didn't have a full-time job. Because hey, now you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a full-time job. And we'll use this list a little bit later on, but I think in general, having that either in the back of your mind or having that written down on a piece of paper, you're gonna go through some tough days when you're looking for a new job. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But there's gonna be days where you just feel like nothing's happening, nothing's moving forward. You've sent all the resumes, you've done all the applications, you've done all this stuff, and you're just sort of in waiting for something to happen kind of mode. And if you've got something on that list, like I'm gonna get in shape, hey, maybe you go for a run or a swim or just take a walk outside. If you've got, I wanna learn how to speak Mandarin, you fire up some little app on your phone and spend 15 minutes learning Mandarin. But that's kind of your repository of positive things that you can use during this time when you're without a full-time job. Now, step 3 is setting the right metric for your job search / getting back to some semblance of however you define productivity. And the metric that I would suggest that you use is a simple one, and that's how many times you're told no. That may sound a little bit self-defeating. Generally, most people don't like to be told no, but it is the perfect metric for something like a job search, because every time you're told no, that means that you stepped into the arena. Even if you get one of those dumb form emails sent from a machine somewhere that says, hey, we've received your application, you're a wonderful human, but we don't have any openings at this time, that means that you took the time to go and find a job that you were interested in, go through all the nonsense of applying for it. You probably had to get your resume together, you maybe had to write a cover letter, you had to do a variety of things to get that no. So even though that no feels like it's a lack of progress or even negative progress, it actually is forward momentum. It means you're playing the game. And you've probably heard all those bromides and stories about people that get told no 500 times before something good happens to them. In my case, I wrote a commercially published book like 15 or so years ago, and I got 63 no's before I finally got a yes, and I'm a published author for whatever that's worth. And you'll get the same thing during the job search. You're going to get those stupid automated emails. You're going to be ghosted at various times. If you are ghosted by somebody for 30 days, I would consider that a no. And if you want, go and put a little tally somewhere in your office or on next to your mirror or whatever in the bathroom, and put a little hash mark every no you get. Because each one of those no's is eventually going to take you to a yes. And each one of those no's means that you're actually stepping into the arena and getting out there and moving forward. Now, step 4 is a little more pragmatic, and that's setting up routines. I think one of the big lies that you'll hear a lot about the job searching process is the old idea that looking for a job now needs to be your full-time job. And like most of these sort of things, there is some truth to that. You are going to have a few weeks where you're putting in an honest 40 hours looking for a job. You're filling out resumes, maybe you're traveling around to go do a bunch of interviews, maybe you've got phone screens, you're responding to things. Some jobs now you have to take these elaborate personality tests or technical tests. And you may have a couple or 3 of those weeks where you've done an honest 40 hours of productive work finding a new job. But you're probably going to have more like 4 to 6 hour weeks, especially after you've done your initial work and kind of tuned up your resume and started getting yourself out there. And the danger of the advice that job hunting should be your full-time job is that you end up spending a lot of days just sort of staring at LinkedIn and doom scrolling through there, seeing that somebody that you interned with in 1994 is now CEO of whatever, and then going down some weird internet rabbit hole trying to figure out where they live and what their life is like and all this nonsense. That's not productive, it's not helpful, and you're not getting anywhere. So broadly speaking, I would put focused, diligent effort into my job search. And when I don't have something to do on that front, I would have other plans. And that's why I suggest setting up a routine. And some of the key elements of that routine, I would have a consistent wake up time and bedtime each day. For me, I'm generally an early riser. So for me, that's waking up between like 5:15 and 6:15. I go to bed around 10 to maybe 10:45-ish each night, get a good 6-7 hours of sleep. And that kind of keeps me running at a fairly efficient level. It keeps me relatively healthy. So I would strive for that consistency. If you're somebody that is like a night owl, be a night owl, just kind of keep that consistent schedule versus, falling into that pattern of waking up whenever, hanging out in your bathrobe for 2 hours, smoking cigarettes and watching Captain Kangaroo. Other things I would incorporate into my routine is I would incorporate some sort of movement / fitness. If you're already a runner, maybe up your ante with running, maybe find some new event or some new distance or some challenge and up your game a little bit. If you're a swimmer, maybe you want to go and extend into triathlon or something like that. If you're somebody that does no fitness and you're kind of repelled by this idea, get yourself outside for 20 minutes each day and take a walk. I would strongly advocate doing at least some outdoor activities. All these studies now that basically say the key to zero cost health is reasonable sleep, sunlight, and some general movement each day. So incorporate that into your routine. I like to do that in the morning. Maybe you like to do that at night. Maybe you're a gym rat. Do whatever, just do some kind of movement because I think that helps you obviously keep physically healthy, but I think your mind is connected to your body, at least in my experience. And if you're physically healthy, if you're eating right, if you're getting some movement in, you're going to stay mentally sharp and you're going to feel a lot better even when things get a little rough out there. The other two elements that I would plan for in my daily routine, plan what I would call some administrative time. Get in there, check your email, kind of keep things moving forward on various jobs you've applied to, set up some sort of tracking systems, whatever you like on that front. And I would also plan for some dedicated networking time. Set aside 60 to 90 minutes each day, and we'll talk a little bit more about networking, because I'm somebody who hears the word networking and a chill runs down my spine, since it sounds like this very forced transactional activity. It doesn't have to be that way. So for now, just build some time into your routine for that activity, and we'll talk a little bit more about an alternative from transactional style networking that at least has worked pretty well for me. So step 5, we're going to go back to that list of all the things that you came up with on if I didn't have a job, I would do X. And we're going to do some deep thinking about what do you want to do longer term in your career. This is a chance to redirect a little bit. For me, when I've had career transitions, I've used that to either stay within the same industry, but maybe move into a different domain, say going from marketing more towards strategy or something like that. This might be an opportunity to take your domain knowledge and apply it to a different industry. Maybe you're a hotshot full stack developer and you've done a bunch of consumer facing stuff. Maybe you want to go more on the corporate side, or maybe you want to go to a nonprofit type of sphere. So have a think on, do I want to add new skills and take them in the same industry? Do I want to take my current skill set, go into a different industry? Or do I want to get out of this whole thing altogether? I would also have a good think on what kind of companies you want to go after in terms of size of the organization. Maybe you want to go and work at a public company versus a private company. Maybe you want to go to big kind of Fortune 500 versus startup, or vice versa. So start to think about what are the parameters that I would change? What did I really like about my previous job? What do I dislike? What interests me out in the industry? And I would make sure you kind of revisit this step every now and then, particularly based on doing your networking and talking to folks that are in different industries, maybe have a slightly different job, and you might hear things that really resonate with you, and you want to use that to inform your job search. All right, step 6. So now hopefully you're a couple or 3 days into things. You've got your routine established. You're starting to think through, what do I want to do with myself longer term? You've got this nice hopper of ideas of things that you might pursue now that you don't have the obligation of working, 30 to 60 hours for somebody else each day. And for this step, I would suggest picking a longer term, what I would call a skill building project. And I'm using the term skill building very generally. This doesn't have to be related to your profession or your work at all. This could be learning how to play piano. This could be learning a language. It might build the studio that I'm sitting in right now, essentially. And I was somewhat handy, had never really done a lot of elaborate construction projects, but I ended up having about 2 months between gigs, and I used that time to learn plumbing, to learn framing carpentry, to learn electrical, to learn tiling. And like 8-ish, 9-ish years later, the place hasn't fallen down yet, so apparently YouTube taught me reasonably well. And those skills have nothing to do whatsoever with my actual profession, but they were something that was interesting to me. They were valuable. It used a different part of my brain, used my hands a lot more than I typically do. Most of my day is spent jockeying a mouse around some PowerPoint slides. So waking up in the morning and spending a few hours setting tile or framing out a bathroom or whatever was an interesting mental change. I also had this idea in the way back of my brain that if things went horribly wrong, there's always generally a need for somebody that can do construction type work. So if I had some basic trade knowledge, I could go and apprentice somewhere, be a handyman, do something like that. The other thing I liked about those projects, and I'm not necessarily suggesting you go and do some sort of construction thing, but if you can find something with an element of visible progress, I think that helps when you're between jobs. And what I mean by that is something like putting down wood flooring. You'd lay some planks, and at the end of the day, you'd be like, all right, more of the floor is covered in wood than there was this morning. If you're framing out a bathroom, you start in the morning, there's no wall there. You finish up at the end of the day, and you got half a wall there. And I like that because so much of the job searching process is out of your control. You can do all the right things and do all the interviews, have a perfect resume, all that stuff. But ultimately, forward progress is kind of in somebody else's hands. At the end of the day, some other organization is going to say, hey, we're going to give you an offer, or they're going to say, we're going to pass. And that can be really frustrating to have your destiny kind of controlled by others. So if you have some sort of project that you can do to fill in those gaps in job hunting time where you can see visible progress, that can kind of keep that feeling of forward momentum. That can help you stick to your routines, and that can help you kind of keep sane throughout this whole process. Some other ideas might be some sort of physical endeavor. If you've never run a 5K before, you can go and get Couch to 5K or something like that. And after a couple or 3 weeks, you'll feel better. You'll feel physical progress. You'll be able to run a longer distance, and you can say, hey, 3 weeks ago I couldn't run 1 mile. Now I can run 1 mile. I'm moving forward with my life. I'd also suggest keeping this open. Maybe you really want to learn some work-related skill. Maybe you're a front-end software developer and you want to learn back-end development. Super cool. That's great. But don't be afraid to be that front-end developer and decide you want to learn how to build clay pottery. I think that's just as good, if not better. Step 7, take advantage of any of the employer assets that you've been given. Some companies, when they transition you out, may provide things like career counseling. They may provide some sort of personality assessment type services. And they're generally somewhere between not great and okay. Most companies aren't going to give you a $50,000 coach to go and help you out, since they've essentially just let you go. But even if they provide some more generic resource, take advantage of it to the extent that it's helpful. I'm not a believer at all in those stupid Myers-Briggs type personality tests, but I had a previous employer offer one and said, what the heck, maybe I'll learn something. And it confirmed some things I knew about myself. It shed some light on some other areas. And for what it was worth worth the time invested, which was fairly light. I would also take advantage of the asset of your network at your former employer. Go and call up people that you liked and avoid the temptation to badmouth the company, avoid the temptation to kind of wallow in your own pity. But just call those folks up and say, really enjoyed working with you, really had a great experience. I learned X by watching you. Give them some sort of specific comment. Don't just call up and say, hey, liked working with you. You're a cool dude. Please help me find a new job. Have a meaningful conversation. And we'll talk about this more in networking, but approach it like a conversation with another human. Don't approach it like a transaction. Don't call and say, hey, can you help me find a gig or something like that? Just keep it on the level of, hey, really enjoyed working with you. Here's my plan. I'm thinking maybe I want to, we worked at a giant company. I'm thinking about working for a smaller company. Do you know anyone that works at startups? Would love to get their experience, or some sort of conversation like that that's meaningful on a human level and has some general asks for connections to people that might be able to help provide you with information versus, hey, do you know anyone that needs to hire a spreadsheet jockey? And, please connect me, and can I send you my resume? I would strongly avoid the temptation to burn any bridges. Don't badmouth your employer. Don't, call people up and tell them they were assholes and they ruined your career or something like that. And, I realize it's tempting. I realize there's people out there that say, you're being dishonest with yourself and the world by, keeping that stuff to yourself. But at least in my, 26-ish years, I've come across people that I've worked with in the past. Some industries can be relatively small, and you don't have to blow smoke up anyone's butt. But also I would avoid, speaking very poorly about your employer, about people you worked with, sort of railing at the unfairness of the situation, and keep things professional. If you want to talk a whole bunch of crap about how much your employer sucked, do it with your dog, do it with a tree in the backyard, do it with your spouse or a friend, but don't do it with anyone that worked there, because that stuff can come back around, and that can come back to bite you in the butt later on. So that brings us to step 8, which is revising your personal marketing material. And you'll note I didn't say revising your resume, getting an elevator pitch or anything like that. I would make the mental shift from, I have this resume that lists everything I've ever done, and it's kind of a bulleted list of, every single job I've held, every single activity I've done, to thinking about yourself like marketing a product. That may feel a little bit cheesy or a little bit awkward, but ultimately whoever is going to hire you is probably somebody that's looking at, a dozen resumes. Maybe they're seeing it for the first time, 6 minutes before they interview you. And I've certainly been in this situation. And they've got, 35 seconds to look at that and come up with some questions to ask you. So put yourself in their shoes. If you pick up like a 6-page thing in a 10-point font that's, starts with, I was a burger flipper at McDonald's, or I was an intern in, whatever in 1987, maybe you don't need those kind of details. Also think about the visual look of some of your material. In my last transition, I went from a like 3-4-ish page, classic bullet point resume to a 1-pager that had just the last 2 places I had worked, had some highlights of my skills. It was professionally designed, had nice fonts, it was visually appealing. And if nothing else, when you picked it up, you'd be like, oh, this is different than the usual 3 or 4 pager. In addition to that, I would work on a 6-second spiel on what are you great at? What do you do that's uniquely awesome that would cause somebody to hire you? Test this with your friends, test this with your family. As you do your networking, test this out with people you're speaking with. And you want to have something that's short, that's pithy, that's memorable. So when that person, maybe runs into somebody that says, hey, I'm looking for a, person that can do X, they think about you and they think about, oh, Joe was just telling me he's the world's best at quickly distilling a concept into a working application prototype. It could be something like that. And by constantly testing this message with people that you talk to, you'll find things you maybe didn't realize about yourself. You'll, I think, hopefully get some confidence out of it. When people tell you like, hey, you're underselling yourself, or hey, what I really liked about working with you was you were a great problem solver, you were a great listener, or you knew everything about strategy and were just this deep expert in some particular subject. And this will come in handy when you meet someone at a party, when you're out at a bar and not in kind of a planned networking or job search type scenario, but somebody hears you're looking for a gig and they say, what do you do? And you've got that quick, short, concise description that is memorable and that they can use then to share, and maybe that gives you a lead somewhere along the way. So step 9, networking. And again, this is a topic with a zillion books, all sorts of approaches. There's probably hours and hours of video you can watch on YouTube. And for me, what I never liked about networking was it always felt kind of transactional. One of the least enjoyable networking type of scenarios for me is where you go into that giant room, there's bad music playing, there's those little random cocktail tables, and there's like 500 people you don't know. And I've always admired people that thrive in that situation. You'll see the people that walk around and talk to everyone and or just have this magnetism about them. I'm generally not that person. So this idea of, formal networking where you contact 600 people and do all these strategies and diagrams and things like that doesn't really appeal to me. And if that does appeal to you, do something that you're good at, that works for you. If you thrive in those rooms with 500 people, there's job fairs, there's industry networking events that you should make sure are on your agenda. But for someone like me, what helped was reframing networking from I'm looking for a job, I'm connecting and doing it strategically, to I'm going to reach out to all the people I've liked, have a relationship with, or just found interesting, and tell them my situation, and we'll have a little bit of a chat. And in some cases, that was people that I worked with out of my first job, and called them up, had a good chat, found out how they were doing, talked about their family, and had some light career chat. I said, hey, I'm in this transition period. This is what happened. Trying to think through what do I do next, and hey, you work in the automotive industry. What's that like? What do you like about it? What don't you like? Have you ever thought of changing into a different industry? No, you love automotive. Oh, why do you love it? Have those types of conversations. I would also say, hey, we worked together for 6 weeks, 6 years, decades, whatever. What did you enjoy about working with me? What do you think my skills were? What do you think I was uniquely good at? And what did you find frustrating, or what were some development areas I should focus on? Don't necessarily take that guidance and restructure your career based on what somebody else has said. But if you start to hear some themes, those may be worth thinking about. I'd also, as part of this, ask people, hey, based on what we just talked about, is there somebody you think I should talk to about X? Try and make it a little more focused. Don't say, hey, is there anyone else I should talk to? Although that works sometimes. But if the person says, hey, I think you'd really enjoy working in nonprofits, say something like, hey, do you know a couple people that are in that space that I might be able to talk to? I've even had really good luck talking to people that I didn't have that deep a relationship with. To give you one example, a guy I probably worked with for, a combined 40, 50 hours maybe. He left the company I was working at the time, made what seemed like a pretty interesting and different transition. And I reached out to him and said, hey, I'm thinking of leaving, thinking of going and doing something else. What was the process you went through? And he actually had some really great tips. We had 3 or 4 calls. He spent a whole bunch of time with me and gave me some really good ideas. And I had some similar conversations with other people that I had, I thought was sort of a light relationship, but just, figured, hey, I'd reach out to these people. They were in, different or interesting industries, or I just, like the cut of their jib. So don't be shy about reaching out to people, make it meaningful. If they don't respond to you or they say no, just check them off the list and move on and put a little tick in your no column, because again, that no means you're moving forward and you're making progress. Now, step 10, again, a big topic, so we're going to keep this relatively light, but sort out your finances. And this can be pretty painful. The spigot has been turned off from incoming dough potentially, and you've, hopefully got some savings stocked up, but all of a sudden you're now kind of sitting on a financial time bomb to some extent. And I don't mean to overplay that, but eventually the money in the bank is going to kind of dwindle and potentially run out. You might have to tap into some other resources. So once you're in a really good mood, make sure you have a nice breakfast, get a good sleep, go out and do something that you really enjoy, get yourself feeling good, because this can be a little painful. You got to go and dig in and figure out what are the resources I have, what's potentially coming in. Do I have some sort of severance? Do you go out and see about unemployment options or something like that? No advice to give you there, since I never took advantage of that. But if nothing else, you kind of want to get at least a general idea of what's your runway. Take a couple months of bank statements, figure out what you've been spending, look at what's in there, and initially figure out how many months can I live off of based on that historical spending. And then you can start to look at what can I trim, can I take out, eating out, where can I reduce some costs. It's not necessarily time to go into ramen noodle mode unless you got nothing in the bank or a whole bunch of debt or something like that. But at least figuring out, hey, I've got 3 months without making any lifestyle changes. Okay, that's a good data point. If I make some lifestyle changes now, I can extend that to maybe 5 months. And then I've got maybe some investments, maybe some loans you could pull out. What's kind of my window before I have to start worrying? This is also a good time to think through, is there something I can do to bring in some supplemental income? Can I go and do consulting? Can I go and do some kind of part-time thing? And you've got to balance out the income that produces versus the opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is, would I have been better off going out and, mowing lawns or flipping burgers or, being a handyman for someone else versus, building my own shop, particularly since there were some material costs involved in that? I don't think so. I think having the flexibility to set my own hours and the ability to kind of learn the entire process of construction versus just doing something for somebody else and only being responsible for a tiny piece of it was pretty valuable for me. So if you need a revenue stream or your kids aren't going to be wearing shoes, by all means, that's a different calculation than I've got some cushion. I'm going to do one of those longer term skill building projects and focus on that versus focusing on keeping income coming in. All that should be based on what's that financial runway that you have and is worth thinking about early, even though I realize that can be a pretty painful process. Now, step 11, I would highly suggest establishing some sort of support network. And this doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be official. It can be, a spouse, a trusted friend. Maybe there's somebody, if your organization did mass layoffs, you got a colleague that you really like that's in the same boat. You're just somebody you can have a regular check-in with. It's easy to feel lonely when you're going through this. It's easy to feel like you're, at least in my case, I often felt like I was sort of this substandard human being, that I wasn't fulfilling my obligations to my family and to the people around me, and kind of wasn't doing what I was supposed to do as a productive dad and husband and all that stuff. And that can be a pretty rough feeling. So to the extent you can find some people to talk to about that, even if it's taking a walk and talking to yourself or talking to the dog, try and get that stuff off your chest and don't let that kind of accumulate and darken things, because you need that focus to get through this process. I'd also try and make sure that within that support network, you've got some honest and positive / tough love kind of people. The one danger of building that network based primarily off of people in the same situation is it's easy to turn that into kind of a group therapy / pity party session. And it's worth having some people that are going to say to you, like, you've been moping around, get off your ass and go do something. And I'm quite lucky in that I have a spouse that serves that role very well. And she has a good understanding of when I need a little bit of a pat on the back and when I need a good swift kick in the ass, which is more frequent than I'd like maybe. But having those people around you that can tell you, hey, you've been moping around, no one's told you no in 3 weeks, that means you're not doing anything. It's time to kind of stop feeling sorry for yourself and get off your butt and get after it. In equal measure to those people that are going to say, hey, this sucks, let me give you a pat on the back and send you on your way. So step 12, the final step in my official, unofficial, getting through getting fired process is schedule a regular self-evaluation. And I would go so far to put this on my calendar. I might do this every week, or if I'm kind of moping, every couple or 3 days. But sit down with yourself, use some sort of journaling tool, use a notepad, use a long walk in the woods, whatever you need to do, and sit down and say, have I gotten any no's recently? Am I making progress? If I'm not getting no's, I'm not playing the game, I'm not getting myself out there, and maybe I need to step it up. How am I feeling? Am I feeling good? Am I sticking to my routines? Am I staying healthy? If you're starting to gain weight, if you're sitting there, hitting the ice cream more than you should, which has happened to me in the past, that's ultimately not going to help you, finish this process a better person or keep yourself focused and kind of sharp and organized throughout the process. I'd also take a little time to visualize, the end state. Lots of people talk about visualization. I think it's an effective technique. Athletes use it all the time. There's nothing wrong with you using it during your job quest. Visualize getting that offer letter for that gig you're really excited about, that hopefully remunerates you appropriately. And think about, the you that's signing that employment agreement. How do you want that you to look? Do you want that you to be a little more fit than when you started? Do you want that you to have some new skill? Do you want that you to be saying, yes, these 3 hours, 3 weeks, 3 months, hopefully not 3 years of, whatever time you had between jobs, I used that well, I used that effectively. Maybe it wasn't the ideal situation, but I made the most out of it. That's the version of yourself that you want at the end of this process. And doing that visualization and looking for those gaps, I think, is a key part of this self-evaluation process. If you're quite a ways away from that you, and the current version of yourself is, again, smoking cigarettes and watching Captain Kangaroo, instead of getting after things, being told no, pursuing some sort of skill building project, getting out there and maintaining fitness, maintaining your health, maintaining your wellness, building out the network, talking to people, doing all those things we've talked about in the previous 11 steps, then it's worth making some course corrections. And it's worth using that self-evaluation process as a bit of an early warning to identify when you're going off the path. And that's going to happen. We're all human. No need to beat yourself up over that. But the more quickly you can recognize that you're off that path, nudge yourself back on, and keep on trucking, the better off you'll come out of this process. And so that is my unpatented process for getting back on your feet after losing your job. Like all things that I give you in these videos, take what's useful, modify what you heard. If there's only one thing out of those 12 steps that resonates and you need to tweak it a little bit to make it applicable to yourself, fantastic. If you think all those 12 steps were utter nonsense, don't use them, dismiss them, go on about your life. And as I said at the beginning, I feel for you. This can be a difficult process. It can really mess with your head if you let it, particularly if you're kind of the primary breadwinner in your household and there's a bunch of people kind of depending on you. So whatever you need to do to kind of keep your wits about you, keep your head about you, and progress through this, keep score with those no's and get towards a new job that you hopefully love and provides at least a couple of years of financial and personal success. More power to you. Big Heavy, wishing you all the best as part of this process, wishing that you come out a better person on the other side of this, and sending good vibes to you across the internet. And as always, a little bit of peace.